Your generous support makes this ministry possible. Thank you.
In a synagogue, you'll have a shamus. When we talk about Hanukkah, we'll talk about the menorah for Hanukkah that has 9 candles, places for candles. 8 days of Hanukkah, 9 candles. What's the 9th for? It's called the shamus candle. The shamus candle is the servant candle. So in churches, you'll have deacons. That word deacon carries the idea of servant. In a synagogue, you will have, and it's usually a volunteer position, it usually comes as a result of honor that they want to pay to somebody who's been to the synagogue for a long time. The shamus, or servant, will make sure that things going on in the worship service are smooth. So if people come late, it's the shamus that's going to make sure they're seated, hold them on the outside, and tell them when they could go in. He's the person that keeps things in order. He's the servant of that synagogue. So he's the one that makes sure that everything runs smooth in a synagogue setting. Okay? In Orthodox settings, there's not too many of these. It would be more observant. 2 people stand on either side of the reading table while the Torah is read and assist the reader and make sure that the Torah service runs smoothly. They would be the ones to call the people up for reading of the Word. It's a not well-known position, usually amongst the minority of Jewish people who are very observant. So almost all synagogues will have a shamus, almost all synagogues will have a cantor, almost all synagogues will have a rabbi, not all of them will have a gabbai. What we want to do now is cover the various sects within Judaism. We've mentioned them before. I've constantly talked about observant and not observant, and we've mentioned Hasidim and conservative and reform and all that. Well, what we want to do is take specific doctrines, and what's very difficult in Judaism versus Christianity. Christianity is defined by doctrines. In Christianity, systematic theology is important. In Christianity, certain doctrines are vital in being able to pinpoint where you are in terms of your faith. So you'll hear things like, do you believe in the triune God? That's a doctrine. It's an important one. Do you believe in heaven or hell? Do you believe in the resurrection? Those are doctrines, and they define us as believers. When we talk to people, if we talk to someone who says, yes, I'm a Christian, no, I don't believe in one God or the Trinity, and a little red flag goes up in our head, and they might believe that they're Christian, but according to our definition, which we would say comes from the Scripture, they are not believers. They need to come to that point where they will recognize and submit to certain doctrines. Judaism is a little different. There are doctrines, but they're not emphasized. They have nothing to do with what synagogue you belong to. And so it becomes difficult to place people in a category. And that, by the way, we like to do that. We, not just Christians, all of us as people want to know when we meet somebody, we classify them. They fall into a certain category in our head based on their conversation, what they believe, where they're coming from. So for our purposes, we have the Hasidic, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, and Reconstructionalism. Hasidic is the most observant. Reconstructionalism is the most liberal, unless you count humanistic Judaism, which I don't have up there. And the reason I do, it's humanistic Judaism. They don't believe in God. They don't believe in higher authority. They believe in that in the sociological aspect of Judaism. That is, they'll practice whatever they want to practice. So there's humanistic bar mitzvahs, but they do what they want. They decide, since there is no God, they decide what they're going to practice. So I don't have it up there because it's kind of a hodgepodge of thinking. So the doctrine is going to be here on the left, and across the top are the various groups of Jewish people who fall in particular categories. So under the first one, which is the Shema, we've already talked about that, Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 specifically through verse 9, says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." That's an important prayer. So what do the various Jewish sects believe about the Shema? Well, the Hasidic Jew says it's a declaration of faith. They know it by heart. It's not something they have to turn to Deuteronomy and read. They know it, they chant it. It's a regular feature amongst the Hasidic Jews. Orthodox, same thing. It's a declaration of our faith. There's total agreement between the Hasidim and the Orthodox concerning the belief in one God. Conservatives, same thing. They know it by heart. It's something they recite. They might not recite it as regularly as, say, the Hasidim or Orthodox, but it's a part of their experience as Jews. And Reform, same thing. Might not be as frequent. They might not get up in the morning every morning and say it, but they know it. It defines them as Jews. Oops, go back. Reconstructionists, the most liberal of all, know it by heart. And so when it comes to the idea or concept of one God, regardless of which Jewish person you meet, the chances are overwhelming that if you meet somebody who's Jewish, they know that portion of Scripture. They probably know it by heart because it's part of the fabric, it's part of the foundation of our identity as Jewish people. So the Shema is something that all of them know about. Now, the Torah. This is going to be a little bit different than the Shema. The Hasidim say, yes, the Torah was given by God to Moses at Sinai and is inspired. 613 commandments are applicable and incorporated into life. Now, when I say that, let me underscore by saying this. There's 613 laws in the Torah. Some 200 of them cannot be followed at all because the temple's destroyed. Okay? So when I say 613 incorporated into life, that's obviously saying with the understanding that right now the temple isn't there, so they know that there's no sacrifices now, and all the laws associated with that can't be followed. But if you asked a Hasidic person, they'd say the Torah is given by God. It is direct from God, given to Moses at Sinai, and is inspired. There is that sense of this is a God book or a God scroll. The Orthodox, given by God to Moses at Sinai, and the 613 are applicable. Again, the Orthodox, who are not as separatists as the Hasidim, still would uphold the Bible or the Torah as from God. Special document given to the people. Conservative, yes, they gave, that was given by God to Moses at Sinai, but the 613 are not all binding. Some are subject to change. Here's where we have movement. these are more liberal than Orthodox and Hasidic. They would argue that in areas that are defined differently by the rabbis, not all these laws are binding for us today. And so there's a change. And that's why they would be at a different synagogue. Orthodox are at a different synagogue than the Hasidim because of separatism. Not because of the Bible, but because of the lifestyle. Conservatives would be different than Orthodox because they don't believe that all the law is binding. So they would move a little bit away. Then you come to the Reform. They would say, no, the Torah was not given by God, that the 613 are not binding, and that rationalism is going to play a role in how we view an important document, but a document written by man, holy men, but men nonetheless. So the view of the word is less as they become more liberal. Reconstructionists, yep, not from God, not binding. Constant change needs to happen as society advances. In fact, you find that evolutionary thinking comes into play the more liberal the people are. By the way, you might be associating in your head, well, wait a minute, this takes place in some of the major Christian denominations. As they become more liberal, or as their view of the Bible becomes more liberal, they become more liberal, and things are subject to change. It's the same principle would play a role in amongst Gentiles as there would be for Jewish people as the word is looked at. When you saw the video, those of you who did, you remember the rabbi, and that was a real event. As we filmed that, we were at the Ark in a synagogue, and there's a button that's pressed, and the curtain opens automatically. And after you press that button once, and then the doors open. And you saw at that synagogue, which by the way was a Reform synagogue, but it had probably 8 or 10 Torah scrolls. All those scrolls were handwritten that you saw in the video, heavily decked out with different coverings. There is a high respect for the Word, even if they don't believe that it's directly from God. But high respect for it. It is an important and holy document for more liberal-minded Jewish people. It is a holy document copied right from what ultimately was the original given to Moses. So it's highly, it's so important that amongst Jewish people, if a person carrying the scroll drops it, the Orthodox rule is 40 days of fasting for dropping the scrolls. It is a holy document. The Scripture themselves. So we're talking about the Torah. We talk about the 5 books of Moses. Now we're talking about the whole Old Testament or the Tanakh, the Scriptures. Hasidic would say inspired, but not quite as inspired as the Torah. So you'll meet very observant Jews, and you might quote if you get a chance, and I've certainly had my opportunity. If you're quoting from the Torah, that's fine. If you're quoting from the prophets, that's okay, but that's not as highly esteemed as the Torah is. It's a step less, if you will. Same thing is true for Orthodox. Same thing is true for conservative. By the time you get to Reform, they're saying it's inspiring to read the prophets. It's inspiring to read it. So it's a document that's important, but not from God. And Reconstructionists would just say, this is like any other important document or book. It's important for us to know. Our lives can be enriched, but it's not from God. It's not from God. Okay, the Talmud. Now let me tell you about the Talmud. The Talmud is extra biblical. That is, the Talmud is composed of oral traditions that have been passed down from the time before the Common Era, or before Christ, to after Christ, some 500 years after him, and compiled together. For the ultra-Orthodox or the Hasidim, the Talmud, Talmudic writing, is often held equally with that of the Torah. Why? The reason is because Moses received the law at Sinai, but God also spoke to him and said things that become what is called oral tradition, passed down from one generation to the next, but never written. So when it was finally compiled, the Hasidic view is that the words that were spoken to Moses, kept, they believe, from generation to generation, finally written down, are just as important as the words that were written. So they hold the Talmud equal with the Torah. Orthodox Jews, the same thing, and there's constant debate that goes on in a Hasidic or Orthodox school, for instance. The way they learn Talmud is an interesting way. The students, you'd have two students standing facing each other, and like a pulpit in between. The rabbi or teacher will walk around and say, you take this position and you take this position, and argue, whatever it is, on a particular law that was for the Sabbath or something related to the temple, whatever it is. You're to argue one side and you're to argue the other side. After a period of time, the rabbi will come by and say, switch positions. In other words, they're now asking you to argue what you argued against before. Now you're arguing for it, and vice versa. What that's going to do, and what the rabbis want to do in training students, is, yes, come up with their own view, whatever that is, but they need to know both sides of it. They need to understand the arguments on each side. So that will happen in Hasidic and Orthodox. The conservative people in a congregation might have never read the Talmud. They know about it. Maybe their rabbis studied it. Chances are good in conservative that they would. They'd be familiar with it. But for people to read it on their own, less of a chance once you're in conservative schools. Some Orthodox haven't either, but conservative, most of the congregations would not be that familiar with Talmud. They know the name, they know what it's involved, but they've never read it. Reform, again, the rabbis would be aware. The people are just glad if they study that, and it's important in their studies when they communicate a sermon or something like that. That's great, but they don't hold the Talmud in any high esteem at all, other than that their rabbi might have mastered it, and they're prideful in a good sense that he's learned, he studied it. That's good. If we have a question, we'll ask him. He's the authority, and so he'll tell us about it. But knowledge of it, very, very seldom amongst Reformed Jews. Same thing for Reconstructionists, lower view of the Talmud. Any questions on those doctrines that you might have? Okay. God. We talked about that in the Shema. The idea of one God. And until you get all the way to Reconstructionalism, that's where, once you come to that group, the concept of God is undefined by them. Most of the other groups have a sense of God, one God. That's, of course, because of the first doctrine we talked about, the Shema, and they know that. So, creation, a creator and king of the universe? They would say yes. Creator and king of the universe, creator and king of the universe. Reform and Reconstructionists go away from creation. I was raised in more of an Orthodox setting, so long before I became a Christian, I had a strong conviction that we were created, that the concept of coming and descending from monkeys was a difficult concept for me, unattainable in my mind. Although today's culture is educated people don't believe in creation because those are for ignorant people. And yet the concept, if you begin to analyze, both concepts are faith concepts because none of them can be duplicated in a scientific way. And thus you have to have a faith to believe one thing or the other. I will tell you that the more liberal they are, the more the chances are of less of believing in creation. God chose Israel as a special people until you get to Reconstructionists, or really Reform as well. Chosenness sits fine amongst observant Jewish people. It is a problem amongst liberal Jews. The idea of being chosen is, in some Jewish circles, an affront because of the concept of equality. No one people is more special than another. Certainly no one people is better in God's eyes than another. And the Bible doesn't teach Jewish people are better. By being chosen, God isn't saying better. In fact, when you read the Torah, it says specifically why he didn't choose us, because we were the most in number, because there was something special about us. But he would be true to the patriarchs, true to his promise given, as you read in Deuteronomy, given back in Genesis, in the first book, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God giving promises. So by the time Jewish people hear about the chosen people, they're using the word chosen as we understand it in our culture. Oh, chosen, that means you're special. Not only you're special, but somehow you've got it better than everybody else. Where the concept of being chosen in the Bible for the Jewish people is not that they're better, but simply because God separated a people, starting with one man, and determined that because of that one man's faith, thereupon subsequent generations, God would keep his promises to them. That becomes an important theme, but when you talk to Jewish people, in fact, you talk to some people who've suffered, Holocaust survivors. If you've ever had a chance to even hear them, if you've ever been to Washington to go to the Holocaust Museum, you'll find that when Jewish people, survivors, talked about this concept of chosenness, they'll say this: I wish he would have chosen somebody else. And the reason they say that is because, wait a minute, if we're a special people, why did all this stuff happen to us? I mean, we're God's special people? I'm not so sure about that, and they base that on their experience. Oh, sorry. Man, the idea of Adam. Adam created, or is man evolving? Was there a literal Adam, or wasn't there a literal Adam? It all boils down to how you take the text. And the more observant the Jewish people are, the more likely they are to believe, yes, there was creation, yes, Adam was created, and then from him, Eve, and there was a literal garden in a literal place, and that sin came into the world. So, again, the more observant, the more they would agree with that. Now, they all agree in the context of Adam and the story that Adam chose to sin, and as a result, he became a sinner. And the potential for sin enters the world. The difference Jewish people have with Christians is the idea of original sin. That is, Christianity teaches sin came into the world, and from that time on, every baby born is born with that sin nature. That is, to a Jewish mind, as a general rule, that concept is an affront. They don't believe it, or they fight it with you. Because the idea is, how could a little baby be blamed by God when it didn't do anything? Whereas the reply would be, we're not saying that baby sinned. We are saying that baby was born in sin. That is, it is born with a sin nature. And the verse in Genesis chapter 5, when Seth is born, tells us that Seth is born in the image, the context of Adam. Remember, Adam was created in God's image. He is God's image, created innocently. After the fall, when Seth is born after Cain kills Abel, Seth is born, it tells us that he's in Adam's image, which, if he's in Adam's image, Adam fell, that becomes a perversion of God's image. We have the handiwork of God. That's fair to say. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. So there is the handiwork of God. But the people that we are as sinful people is a direct result of sin, and it's passed down from one generation to the next. Now, in talking like that, the Jewish mind would say, how could you possibly do two things at once and believe that to be true? How could you believe such a thing? Only ignorant people would believe such a thing. But again, it's the text. The text becomes the authority for observant people. And clearly, even if it's not the Bible, the more fundamental you are in your faith, whatever that faith is, you're going to have an objective truth. The more liberal you become, the more your authority takes over and you decide what is true or not true. And that's the difference. It's the basis of authority. So born pure, man chooses, born pure. And Reconstructionists even have the idea of some of the New Age thing, the idea of a divine spark. That's a New Age kind of thinking that's been incorporated amongst liberal Jewish people. Any questions so far as what we've covered? A few things. Okay. Oops, there we did it again. Death. We've talked a little bit about this. What happens at death? Is there an afterlife? And if there is, how do you get there? Does the Bible have anything to say about that? Well, in the Old Testament, it doesn't say a lot, but it does have some things to say. In Daniel chapter 12, it says, "Those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." Oftentimes the Jewish argument is, well, Jewish people don't believe in hell because the Bible doesn't talk about hell. Fair enough. When I talk to a Jewish or Gentile person and show them that verse, some to shame, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. The question I always say to them is, where do you want to go? Where do you want to be in this? You got two choices, column A, column B. Everlasting life or shame and everlasting contempt. So we don't call it hell. The Bible doesn't call it hell, but it calls it a specific thing that is not good, as opposed to a place that is good. And again, depending on your commitment to the text, it's going to determine how you feel about eternity and is there eternity. The Orthodox view is there is eternity, and that for the person who seeks to live a holy life, to follow the commandments, that person is going to be judged for his deeds, and if his good deeds outweigh his bad deeds, they're in. And when you think of, we're talking about funerals, when you think of people who've passed on, who've done wonderful things, religious things as well as secular things, helping people, giving to people, encouraging people, from a human point of view, who would ever dream that a person who we call good, that definition of good becomes a problem. Who defines what's good? Good can be a subjective, very subjective word. For instance, if we were living in, say, downtown Chicago, I live in Philadelphia, downtown Philadelphia, or LA, and you're part of a gang, okay? Your parents were split, you don't even know who your father was, he took off, you're raised by your mother, she runs away, your grandmother, she couldn't control you. Now you're taken in by a gang. The gang is supplying you with your emotional needs. You're involved in that gang. There's a whole set of mores that go on. There might be an initiation, let's say, in that gang, and it's to do an awful thing. But in order to be accepted, you need to do that. In that gang, if you didn't do it, you would be doing a bad thing. And if you did do it, you'd be doing a good thing. So the concept of good can only be determined within the context of whoever's defining it. Again, unless you have an objective truth. So good can be agreed upon by reasonable people, but at the same time argued as to whether it's good or not. That's why you need someone objective, God, who tells you what is good and who tells you what's accepted and not accepted, even if what's not accepted by him seems good to you. So, you with me? Because sometimes I wonder if I'm making sense, but I hope you're with me. Okay. The idea of being cremated, we've already talked about cremation versus burial. The more observant you are, the less likely to be cremated. The less observant you are, the more likely the cost is going to play a key, and so that decision will be made accordingly. Resurrection. And we'll talk about Messiah and all that in the next one. But resurrection. Judaism, biblical Judaism, believes in a resurrection. There is the concept in Judaism of a resurrection. I just quoted from Daniel for you. Psalm 16 talks about the resurrection, being raised. Job chapter 19 talks about Job, even though worms eat my body, yet he said he would be raised. And so the concept of life after death and bodily resurrection amongst observant Jews is taught. And the resurrection will take place at the coming of the Messiah. And so Hasidic Jews look for the Messiah. They believe in the Messiah, and they believe when he comes, then all the dead bodies will be resurrected, and there'll be a kingdom on the earth. Same thing for Orthodox. Conservative, yes, but they don't talk about the concept of the Messiah nearly as much. It's kind of like, we'll try to cover our bases, and I say this with respect. I'm giving a general view here. We do a lot of the things the Orthodox do, but we're not quite sure, so they lean that way. There might be conservatives who don't. It's kind of a much more nebulous thing, the concept of the Messiah. But by the time you get to Reform and Reconstructionists, the idea of resurrection, not really. You'll find the rabbis or people who are Reform or Reconstructionists say, well, if there is, again, if you're a good person, God will understand. But my human mind can't accept that kind of thinking. It doesn't make sense to me. The rationale behind it is too difficult, so therefore I reject it. So you'll meet liberal Jewish people who have no concept of the resurrection or for that matter, the Messiah as well. Sin. We've talked a little bit about that already. The more observant you are, the more likely your consciousness of sin. And your concept of sin will not be determined as applied to civil law. It will be applied to biblical precepts. So the more liberal you become, first of all, the more liberal you become, the less you use the word sin. Sin is a word that Western culture does not like to talk about. There are some Christian churches who have shied away from preaching about sin. You read all kinds of things about some new movements that are out that just say talking about sin is a negative thing that should not be part of the church. One of the most well-known persons to talk about that was Joel Osteen. If you've ever seen him preach, I don't know, 60,000 people that he preaches. He was on Larry King Live, and he talked, and Larry King, Jewish man, by the way, asked him about the concept of sin, and he said, I don't talk about sin. We don't deal with sin. We are upbeat. We want to talk about positive things. The only way you could do that is to move away from what the text says. And so the very observant Jews are close to the text, therefore sin is important, the concept of sin, and how we deal with sin, and asking forgiveness for sin. Where the more liberal you are, the less concerned you are. Messiah, Jewish concept of Messiah. 1994, a Rebbe, as opposed to a rabbi. A Rebbe is, for the Hasidim, kind of a step higher than a rabbi, sometimes even associated with powers, mystical kinds of powers. There was a very great rabbi who passed away in 1994, and his name was Rabbi Menachem Schneerson. Rabbi Schneerson was Hasidic, and great things were attached to him. He was called a miracle worker. And if you were to go to Israel in the early 90s, there'd be banners all across Israel, particularly in Jerusalem, but all over. And the banners would read, "Prepare for the coming of the Messiah. Messiah is coming soon. Now is the time of Messiah." Those banners were placed by Hasidim, Orthodox, very Orthodox Jews, who believed that Rabbi Schneerson was, in fact, the Messiah. Now, he was born in Europe. He wasn't born in Bethlehem. He wasn't born of a virgin mother, and never stepped foot into Israel. But the banners were there because there was a belief that Rabbi Schneerson, at the right time, would bring in the kingdom. In fact, not far from the airport outside of Tel Aviv is a brownstone, for those of you who live on the East Coast, in New York, a brownstone home, the only one built in Israel, built for Rabbi Schneerson when he came. Well, he never made it. He died at I think it was about 92 years old. He never set foot there. But to this day, there are a small, very small amount of Hasidic Jews who believe that he's going to resurrect from the dead and be the Messiah. Question?
What do the Jews do with Jesus? Like, do they just destroy the story in the Bible entirely, or?
The question is asked, what do the Jewish people do with Jesus? That is a simple question, profound, because there isn't one answer I can give to you. For some liberal Jews, they go to college in whether it's in Europe or here. They go to college. They're raised in a Jewish home, and they take a course. The Bible is literature, and they read for the first time, or maybe they've read it on their own before, as literature, the New Testament. For some of them, they become fascinated with the person of Jesus. And some of them search. It's been known to happen that just by the reading, because of interest, they ultimately come to faith. Others just marvel at his wisdom, marvel at the world's fascination with this one man living at a time period before technology. 12 people follow him. One fails him or turns him in, betrays him, and yet the whole world knows about him. So for some Jewish people, there's a great attraction. For others, he's their worst nightmare. Just saying his name is an offense. Because while they might not attribute him to being the bad person, so many people might have a high opinion of him, they'd have a low opinion of the Apostle Paul. They'd have a low opinion of any Jewish follower who betrayed their people to follow him. There'd be Jewish people who'll defend him, saying he never claimed to be anybody special. They did it to him, and on and on. So I wish I could give you one answer, but the good news in answering that is that since we don't know, in many instances, we are, and I got to be careful, I'm on tape, but I'm saying it anyway. We are Jesus to people who see us in the world, whether they're Jewish or not. By that I mean, by being a follower of Jesus, they can see who he is by the commitment we have, by the life that we live. And so the Bible talks about making them jealous, Gentiles, making them jealous. How's that happen? That happens as a result of a Gentile who, are born into a, quote, Christian home, raised that way, going to church, reading the Bible, coming to a point where they recognize they're a sinner, living their life for Jesus Christ around people who see them, and oftentimes the question from a Jewish point of view is, and it happened with me in college. That was the first Christian I met, was in college. I thought this guy was strange. Strange. We use the expression, a French fry short of a Happy Meal. In those days, that's what we said. A quart low. He was weird. Why? Because he's in college. Nobody is making him live what I would have described back in those days as a holy life. But he did. And while I thought the guy was crazy, it impressed me. And so when you ask the question, and I'm not trying to be preachy in the answer, it's a hard answer. When you ask the question, what do Jewish people do with Jesus? They do lots of different things. Anything from hate and spit on his name to being fascinated and constantly pursuing who he is, even if they fall short of making a crossover in faith. The person of Jesus has confounded many a mind. And so Jewish people fall into that category. The best thing we can do is to demonstrate with our life who Jesus is, and maybe after they read us as the only Bible they might read, they'll ultimately go to the text. And not surprisingly, when we have opportunity to relate to our Jewish friends, one of the things that has to happen, and for almost any Jewish believer, is what's called fulfilled prophecy. That is, the going to the text, Old Testament, not New Testament, it's not their Bible, and saying, look, this prophet, or Moses, said this, a prophet will come like unto Moses. Who is that special prophet? Description of someone born in Bethlehem, specifically southern Bethlehem, from a virgin, who will then take on our transgressions. That's what I'm describing for you is prophetic in the Jewish scriptures. Are there answers for that? The rabbis have answers for that, all of them, and they're not Jesus. But for the reader of the text, what picture is being painted, and do you know of anybody who fulfilled those things? That's why there's Jews and Gentiles who believe, they take the step of faith, and Jews and Gentiles who say, that's crazy, I don't believe it. That's why you have people raised in Christian homes who never become Christians, even though they're exposed to it. And that's why you have some who weren't raised in Christian homes, like me, and embrace him. How is that? I can't answer that. God is sovereign. But I can say that Jesus is the perpetual issue. He is the issue. And people respond differently. I joked in chapel today, you get 2 Jewish people, you get 3 opinions. Conservative estimate. I always say that. It's true. We love to argue. Arguing is a major deal amongst our people. And certainly during the time of Jesus, as well as today, he is often the point of contention, even amongst Jewish people. Long answer for a short question. But Messiah. Reform or liberal Jews don't look for a personal Messiah. They are looking for a messianic age. Important concept. A messianic age. That's where the whole function of evolution comes into play, because you have well-educated people who are understanding of that whole concept of, they think, getting better. So for them, it's not going to be a Messiah that's going to bring peace to the earth. Man will finally reach a point where he'll be educated enough, begin to realize in his head, just as the prophet said, that weapons of war will be turned into instruments of agriculture, and will study war no more. Well, those that believe in the text say the only one who can do that is God himself, through the Messiah. He'll bring peace. Those that reject that say, no, man will usher that. Man will achieve that. This idea of getting better. There still, believe it or not, is the concept in Western thought that education, you always hear that, education is the solver of all problems. We'll do away with poverty through education. We'll do away with hate through education. We'll do away with hunger through education. The United States has poured in billions of dollars, billions. And Jesus said, you'll always have the poor. He's right. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try to help. That's not what I'm saying. But it's interesting that the observant view, and Orthodox would fall in this category, they'd say, there will never be peace on the earth, the observant Jew would say, until Messiah comes. And born-again Christians are right next to him, saying, absolutely. The only way there'll be peace on the earth is when Messiah comes. Now, the difference is, who is he? The identity of the Messiah. That will be the key, but the belief is the same. Zionism. Anybody ever hear of that term, Zionism? What do you think it is? Any guesses? Not a trick question, by the way. I don't do those. So, you could take a guess? Want to take a guess?
Yeah. The return of Israel, return of the people of Israel to their country.
Okay. The definition is the return of Jewish people to their country. That's not 100% right, but it's close. And you're on target in the sense that you used their country. Zionism, there were Zionists before Jewish people returned to their country. And what made them Zionists was the belief that there is a land, a specific land for a specific people. A specific land for specific people. Now, you could believe that and not be religious. In fact, the early Jewish Zionists were mostly socialists. They lived in Eastern Europe. Theodor Herzl, who's called the father of Zionism, modern Zionism, lived right before the turn of the 20th century. He died, I think, in 1905. He was secular in his thinking, but he believed that the Jewish people needed a homeland, and he wanted to secure that homeland through international law. And so he formed the first Zionist Congress that met in 1897. They're religious Zionists. there was a Christian by the name of Heckler who befriended Herzl. He was a born-again Christian. And when he heard Herzl speak and saw his passion and drive for a homeland, his knowledge of the Word as a believer, as a Zionist, believing that God would fulfill His promises with the people of Israel in the land, with the Jewish people in the land of Israel, supported Herzl as a believer. So you could be Zionist and be religious, or you could be Zionist and be secular. You could be anti-Zionist and be religious. For instance, there are a group of Hasidic Jews who are against the nation of Israel. The reason is because only Messiah has the authority to establish our land. And there's a good chunk within the ultra-Orthodox movement who are against Israel, modern state of Israel. They call them sinful. They're in the flesh. They're living as Jews without following the law, and that concept is very hard for them. So Zionism is the belief in a place. I'm a born-again Zionist, a Christian Zionist. By that, I'm a believer in the Lord Jesus Christ who believes that God has selected a chosen people for His purpose and will ultimately place them in the land that He promised. So I would say it's a biblical reason to be Zionistic. You could be secular and say, well, I could go to the UN, and under international law, these countries got together after the Holocaust took place, where the Jewish people were severely persecuted, and they allotted a land called Israel, and all the nations agreed it is an internationally binding law on the books that says it's their land, and they're entitled to it. So you could be totally secular and believe that they have a right to the land. So a Zionist is one who believes that they have a right to the land. So some Hasidic are Zionistic, and some are not Zionistic. Same thing for Orthodox, although the Orthodox tend to be more uniform in their belief in Zionism. Conservative would probably mostly be Zionistic. Reform and Reconstructionism, it depends. It depends. We now have within Judaism what's called the post-Zionist movement. It's by a very small minority of ultra-left Jewish people who believe that what happened in 1948 was a violation of Palestinian people and would argue as Jews against the nation of Israel. They would be called post-Zionists. Very small percentage of people. It's a more recent phenomenon, but certainly you have to say it's true. But if you're going to look at all of Judaism, the majority of Jewish people are Zionists. Majority. Amongst Christians, it depends on their theology as to whether they're going to be Zionistic or not. We at Emmaus, I know you have a trip coming up in May. Anybody taking that trip? Here, okay, great. You're going in May. And that a trip to Israel will change your perspective on the Bible. It just will. The pages of Scripture, old or new, come alive as you realize you're in the place where all these things took place. It's a life-changing experience.